This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. The White House's National Security Advisor says the U.S. intends to launch further strikes at Iran-backed groups in the Middle East after hitting Tehran-aligned factions in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen over the last 2 days. Reuters correspondent Alex Cohen has more.
The strikes come a day after the U.S. military hit Tehran-backed groups in Iraq and Syria in retaliation for a deadly attack on U.S. troops in Jordan. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told NBC Sunday that the U.S. intends to take, quote, additional action to continue to send a clear message that the United States will respond when our forces are attacked. Saturday's strikes in Yemen hit buried weapons storage facilities, missile systems, launchers, and other capabilities the Houthis have used to attack Red Sea shipping, the Pentagon said, adding it targeted 13 locations.
Reuters correspondent Alex Cohen. Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said on Sunday strikes on Yemen's Houthis were self-defense against the Iran-backed group's continued targeting of commercial ships and warships in the Red Sea.
I've been clear that I won't hesitate to protect British lives, British interests, and our diplomatic efforts are focused on bringing de-escalation and stability back to the region.
The U.S. and British strikes were the latest sign of spreading conflict in the Middle East since war erupted between Israel and Hamas after the militant Palestinian group's deadly assault on Israel October 7th. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Sunday Israel was not ready to accept a deal at any price to release hostages held by Hamas. Hamas and the Houthis are U.S.-designated terrorist groups by the State Department and the White House. This is VOA News. Wildfires sweeping through central Chile have killed at least 99 people and hundreds are still missing, authorities said on Sunday, as President Gabriel Boric warned that the country faces a, quote, tragedy of very great magnitude. Wildfires that began several days ago are menacing the outer edges of Vina del Mar and Valparaiso, two coastal cities popular with tourists. The urban sprawl of those cities accounts for more than 1 million residents west of the capital, Santiago. Chilean authorities introduced a curfew in the hardest hit areas and sent in the military to help firefighters stem the spread of fires, while helicopters dumped water to try to douse the flames from the air. In a Russian-occupied city in Ukraine's Luhansk region, Moscow installed officials said an attack on Saturday killed at least 28 people in a bakery, with at least one child among the dead. VOA's Arash Arbasadi has more.
At a field hospital just a few kilometers from frontline fighting, injured soldiers arrive in need of medical attention. One soldier describes increasingly closer explosions until one struck his position, saying his leg then moved wherever it liked. And for those stationed on the southeastern front, a visit from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in which he handed out medals to soldiers near a position once occupied by Russian forces. Arash Arbasadi, VOA News.
Several U.S. judges have been trying to set the record straight when it comes to claims that suspects in the deadly January 6, 2021 Capitol riot are being unfairly treated. AP correspondent Jackie Quinn reports.
1349 hours declaring it a riot.
A federal judge in North Carolina, Royce Lamberth, presided over the trial of one of the Capitol insurrection suspects. He warns that any efforts to portray the violent mob that stormed the Capitol as political prisoners or hostages is a serious threat to the nation and could stoke more violence. Another judge in Washington, D.C. scolded a rioter with a long criminal record who complained the trial was unfair. That's something candidate Donald Trump said on the anniversary of the insurrection.
If you're with us, they put you in jail. Look at what's happened with the J6 hostages,
Trump has been floating the idea of pardons if he's reelected. I'm Jackie Quinn.
Zimbabwe's ruling party now commands a two-thirds majority in parliament. It could amend the constitution and prolong President Emerson Mnangagwa's control after by-election results released Sunday. Find more online at voanews.com. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA News. This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Russia accused U.S. President Joe Biden on Monday of carrying out strikes in Iraq and Syria to boost his image as the presidential election campaign is heating up, not in retaliation for a deadly attack on American soldiers. The United States began the airstrikes on Friday against dozens of targets linked to Iran-allied groups after 3 U.S. soldiers were killed in Jordan in an attack Washington blames on Iran-backed militias. Last week's wave of U.S. airstrikes in Iraq, aimed at pounding targets associated with almost 170 attacks by Iranian-backed militias on U.S. forces in the region, appears to be expanding the fissure between Washington and Baghdad. VOA national security correspondent Jeff Selden has the latest.
The Pentagon rejected Iraqi allegations that those killed were with the Iraqi security forces.
As we conduct these strikes, we are very focused on Iranian-backed proxy groups.
Major General Pat Ryder.
We're striking terrorist groups that are supported by the IRGC.
Ryder says Baghdad is a valued ally, adding the U.S. is not planning for a long-term military campaign against the militias in Iraq and Syria. Jeff Selden, VOA News, the Pentagon.
Israeli helicopters and a tank were seen firing along the Gaza-Israel border on Monday as Israel pressed on with its offensive in some of the war's most intense combat. The Israeli military said on Monday its forces had killed dozens of Palestinian militants during fighting in northern, central, and southern Gaza over the last 24 hours. Palestinians described heavy combat in Gaza City, particularly its western areas close to the Mediterranean shore. This is VOA News. Ukraine's president is floating a military shakeup, a possibility that's shocking his wartime nation and worrying its Western allies, AP correspondent Sagar Magani reports.
When he was Joint Chiefs Chairman, Mark Milley often mentioned General Valery Zaluzhny.
My counterpart, whom I talk to very frequently, several times a week.
Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky tells an Italian broadcaster he's thinking about firing the popular military chief as part of a bigger leadership overhaul, saying the nation must be led by those convinced of victory over Russia. Zaluzhny's considered a national hero. Zelensky strongly objected during the fall when Zaluzhny said the fighting was at a stalemate after Ukraine's much-anticipated counteroffensive disappointed allies. Sagar Magani, Washington.
Volunteers in central Chile are trying to remove charred metal, broken glass, and other debris in neighborhoods destroyed by forest fires that have killed at least 122 people in densely populated areas over the past 3 days. Hundreds of people remain missing. The fires appeared to have diminished by Monday morning after burning intensely since Friday on the eastern edge of the city of Vina del Mar. 2 other towns in the Valparaiso region have also been hit hard. President Gabriel Boric said that at least 3,000 homes had been burnt down in the area. Lawmakers in Senegal were debating extending President Macky Sall's mandate on Monday after he delayed this month's election, a move that has caused anger and unrest. Reuters correspondent David Doyle has more.
In the streets of Dakar, shouts of Macky Sall is a dictator and Macky Sall is an assassin. Crowds gathered on Monday to protest the postponement of Senegal's February the 25th election. That decision, announced by President Macky Sall on Saturday, sparked anger and unrest over the weekend. It also threatened to tarnish the West African country's reputation as a bastion of democracy in a region swept by military coups.
Reuters correspondent David Doyle. After spending more than 7 decades waiting to become sovereign, Britain's King Charles has been diagnosed with a form of cancer less than 18 months since he ascended to the throne. Buckingham Palace on Monday announced that Charles, 75, would postpone public-facing duties while he undergoes treatment, but was looking forward to returning to full public duty as soon as possible. Charles became monarch on the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth, on September 8, 2022, having been the longest-serving heir apparent in British history. He was crowned on May 6, 2023. Find more on our website, voanews.com. I'm Joe Ramsey. This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday during a lightning tour of the Middle East said Washington was reviewing Hamas's response to a ceasefire proposal, and he would discuss it with Israeli officials when he visits the country on Wednesday.
There's still a lot of work to be done, but we continue to believe that an agreement is possible and indeed essential, and we will continue to work relentlessly to achieve it.
U.S. designated terrorist group Hamas earlier issued a statement saying it had submitted its response. U.S. President Joe Biden blamed former President Donald Trump for blowing up a bipartisan border security agreement. Details from VOA's chief national correspondent Steve Herman in Washington.
The likely Republican Party presidential nominee, Donald Trump, is responsible for intimidating Republicans to back away from the bipartisan border security bill, according to President Biden, because Trump would prefer chaos ahead of this November's election.
So Republicans have to decide, who do they serve? Donald Trump or the American people? Are they here to solve problems or just weaponize those problems for political purposes?
The $118 billion package also includes aid for Israel and Ukraine. Berman, VOA News, Washington.
Chile's former president, Sebastian Pinera, a billionaire tycoon who twice held the South American nation's top job, died Tuesday in a helicopter crash, his office said in a statement. The 74-year-old Pinera often flew himself around in his own helicopter and was a former shareholder in the country's national airline, with stakes in television and football, among other businesses. This is VOA News. Lower temperatures on Tuesday brought relief to central Chile, where firefighters tried to extinguish the remnants of wildfires that have killed at least 131 people in recent days, while families combed the rubble in a search for missing relatives. Only 35 victims have been identified and hundreds remain missing because of the fires, which broke out late last week and then spread to large swaths of central Chile, the worst natural disaster to strike the South American nation since the 2010 earthquake and tsunami that left more than 500 dead. Crowds gathered in Antakya on Tuesday, the capital of the southern Turkish province of Hatay, on the one-year anniversary of the devastating earthquake that struck Turkey and neighboring Syria, killing tens of thousands. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
Millions across Turkey are mourning the loss of more than 53,000 friends, loved ones and neighbours killed in the country's catastrophic earthquake a year ago. To mark what it calls the disaster of the century, the government has put on commemorations. But crowds, angry with how officials handled the tragedy, jostle with police chanting "Government resign," while crowds walking on the banks of the Orontes River called for Lutfu Savas, the mayor of Hatay, to resign. Amid the fog by the Orontes River, people chanted, "Can anyone hear us?" echoing the voice of those buried under the rubble. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
A U.S. federal appeals court Tuesday unanimously rejected Donald Trump's claim he's immune from criminal charges that he plotted to overturn his 2020 election defeat, Reuters correspondent Zachary Goldman reports.
The ruling is a rebuke to the former president, who is once again seeking the White House as he fends off numerous criminal cases. The election subversion case landed before the three-judge appeals panel after Trump was criminally charged by special counsel Jack Smith with a number of illegal schemes to try and stay in power after losing at the polls. Trump denies wrongdoing and claims he's immune from prosecution for acts taken while president. Trump is almost certain to appeal Tuesday's decision all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Even if his claims are ultimately rejected, he may achieve his aim of delaying trial until after the November election. If Trump wins the election, he could seek to pardon himself or direct the Justice Department to shut down the case.
Reuters correspondent Zachary Goldman. U.S. President Joe Biden said on Tuesday that the bipartisan immigration bill is falling apart under political pressure from Republican Party rival Donald Trump, and urged lawmakers to have a quote-unquote spine and pass the much-needed measure. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA News. This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is rejecting Hamas's terms for a ceasefire and hostage release deal, AP correspondent Sagar Magani reports.
After meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's in the Middle East again in hopes of brokering a ceasefire, Netanyahu called the Hamas terms, which include ending the war, delusional, and vowed to keep fighting until absolute victory. Hours later, Blinken said while the Hamas proposal does have some non-starters,
we do think it creates space for agreement to be reached.
Hamas says it will send a delegation to Cairo for more talks. Sagar Magani, Washington.
The United States military said it carried out a drone strike on a vehicle in Baghdad on Wednesday, killing a leader of an Iranian-backed militant group in Baghdad. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb reports.
It was a unilateral strike conducted by U.S. forces against a major commander for Kataib Hezbollah. Kataib Hezbollah is the Iranian-backed militant group that has been responsible for striking U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan.
Hear more from Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb on VOA News' International Edition. Republican Party U.S. senators on Wednesday defeated a bipartisan effort to bolster border security that had taken months to negotiate, but said they could still approve aid for Ukraine and Israel that had been tied up in the deal. By a vote largely along party lines, the Senate failed to approve a $118 billion bipartisan package that would tighten immigration laws, help Ukraine fight a Russian invasion, and bolster Israel in its war with Hamas, a U.S.-designated terrorist group. This is VOA News. 2 explosions near electoral candidates' offices in Pakistan's southwestern province killed more than 25 people and wounded dozens on Wednesday. Reuters correspondent Fiona Jones reports.
On the eve of a general election, the blasts in the southwestern province of Balochistan raised concerns over security. Pakistan goes to the polls on Thursday amid rising militant attacks and the jailing of Imran Khan, the winner of the last national election. Khan has been dominating the headlines despite an economic crisis and other woes threatening the nuclear-armed country. Authorities have said they are boosting security at polling booths.
Reuters correspondent Fiona Jones. Residents say one of eastern Congo's most active rebel groups is attacking a community considered the last line of defense before the region's largest city of Goma. The M23 rebels claim they have no intention to seize Goma again, but warn that attacks targeting its forces will be dealt with at their source. The group rose to prominence a decade ago by seizing Goma, which is an important base for Congolese forces and for humanitarian workers. United Nations agencies are appealing for $4.1 billion to provide urgent aid for more than 17 million civilians inside war-torn Sudan and those who have fled to neighboring countries. Lisa Schlein reports for VOA from Geneva.
UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths says the international community has largely forgotten the country amid high-profile crises in Gaza, Ukraine, and elsewhere.
But I don't think there's anywhere quite so tragic in the world today as Sudan. The figures speak for themselves. There's 25 million people in Sudan who need assistance. Half of them are children. That's an astonishing figure.
He says the expansion of fighting in Sudan, including to Al Jazeera, the country's so-called breadbasket, has worsened the situation. Lisa Schlein for VOA News, Geneva.
Thousands rallied in front of Slovakia's parliament on Wednesday to condemn a plan by the new government of the populist prime minister to eliminate the office of the special prosecutor dealing with major crime and corruption. A final vote is Thursday. A number of people linked to the prime minister parties face prosecution and corruption scandals. European Union institutions have questioned the planned changes to the penal code, which also includes reducing punishment for corruption and a significant shortening of the statute of limitations. Find more online on our website, voanews.com. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA.
This is VOA News. I'm Alexis Strope. The Justice Department says Joe Biden willfully kept and disclosed classified material while a private citizen. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Meghani reports.
The documents were found in a cardboard box in his Delaware garage, in his basement, and elsewhere. It's a hard assessment of his handling of sensitive material, but it also clears the president of any criminal wrongdoing.
The special counsel in my case decided against moving forward with any charges. This matter is now closed.
The president at a Democratic retreat saying he cooperated fully with the year-long probe. It's separate from the one charging Donald Trump with illegally hoarding top-secret records at his Florida estate. Biden's probe likely blunts his efforts to hammer Trump for his as they move toward a likely November showdown. Trump says this is a two-tier justice system, and Biden's case was far more severe than his. Sagar Meghani, Washington.
Israeli airstrikes have killed over a dozen people overnight, hours after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected Hamas's ceasefire terms and vowed to expand the offensive into the southern Gaza town of Rafah. More than half of Gaza's population has fled to Rafah on the mostly sealed border with Egypt. It is also the main entry point for humanitarian aid. Egypt has warned that any ground operation there or mass displacement across the border would undermine its 4-decade-old peace treaty with Israel. Residents at the scene of one of the strikes early on Thursday used their cell phone flashlights as they dug through the rubble with pickaxes and their bare hands. You'll find expanded coverage of world news and events 24 hours a day at voanews.com. This is VOA News. President Volodymyr Zelensky replaced Ukraine's popular army chief with his ground forces commander on Thursday. Angela Johnston from Reuters reports.
In a statement, Zelensky named Colonel General Alexander Syrskyi as the new head of the armed forces. Some call Zaluzhny the Iron General, and many Ukrainians see him as a national hero. His dismissal could deal a blow to morale and potentially backfire politically for Zelensky. Polling suggests Zaluzhny has more of the public's trust than the president. Zelensky's statement says he asked the general to stay on his team. For his own part, in his own statement, Zaluzhny said the tasks of 2024 are different from those of 2 years ago. Everyone must change and adapt to the new realities, he said. Syrskyi takes over during a period of deep uncertainty. Kyiv is waiting for vital military aid from the United States that has been delayed for months by political infighting.
Angela Johnston from Reuters. The Senate is beginning work on a package of wartime funding for Ukraine and other U.S. allies, but doubts remained Wednesday about the level of support from Republicans who have rejected a carefully negotiated compromise that also included border enforcement policies. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has tried to salvage $60 billion in funding for Ukraine, as well as roughly $35 billion more for Israel, other allies, and national security priorities. The new effort comes after the collapse this week of a bipartisan agreement to tie border enforcement policies to the package. GOP leaders are scrambling to find a plan that their senators can back. Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, showed the marks left by 3 consecutive days of protests. VOA's Rick Pantaleo tells us more.
Bullet shells and bloodstains marked the place where police killed 5 armed environmental protection agents in the Laboule community on Wednesday. Prime Minister Ariel Henry urged calm in a public address Thursday following 3 days of violent protests that paralyzed the country. I think the time has arrived for all of us to put our heads together to save Haiti. Thousands of Haitians gathered daily this week in cities and towns across the country to demand the Prime Minister step down, saying they will keep protesting until he leaves. Rick Pantaleo, VOA News.
A panel of UN-backed experts that focuses on children's human rights is calling on Russia to prevent efforts to rewrite school curricula and textbooks to reflect the government's, quote, political and military agenda, including in Ukraine. The Committee on the Rights of the Child held hearings in Geneva last month before presenting its findings Thursday on conditions in Russia. The International Criminal Court last year issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner. It's accusing them of deporting and abducting children from Ukraine. Russia's mission in Geneva says Moscow will respond to the report. For additional stories, visit voanews.com. I'm Alexis Strope, VOA News.